The final tally is 6-7, and the room goes quiet. On July 2, 1776, in the stifling heat of the Pennsylvania State House, the Continental Congress votes on Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. It fails. New York's delegates, still bound by instructions from their provincial Congress forbidding any vote for independence, abstain, which under the rules counts against the motion. Pennsylvania's delegation splits exactly as John Dickinson had engineered it, with his reconciliation bloc outnumbering Benjamin Franklin and John Morton, and South Carolina's Edward Rutledge, who privately harbors no love for British overreach, refuses to cast the vote that would have delivered unanimity. Without unanimity, he reasons, the cause is weaker than silence. John Adams sits in his chair and watches the gavel fall. He had spent weeks lobbying, cajoling, arguing until his voice cracked. He had delayed the original vote from June to July, confident the extra time would bring reluctant delegations into line. Delaware's Caesar Rodney had ridden through a thunderstorm overnight to break his delegation's tie, arriving mud-spattered and feverish. And it had not been enough. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. What no one in that room understood yet, what would not become clear for months, was that this single vote had not merely delayed independence, it had killed it. Within days, John Dickinson moves to fill the vacuum. The author of Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, the most respected legal mind in the reconciliation faction, drafts a new petition to the Crown. It is careful, measured, and deliberately modest. It offers cessation of all hostilities in exchange for the restoration of colonial rights as they existed before 1763, before the Stamp Act, before the Intolerable Acts, before everything that had driven the colonies toward rebellion. The petition passes Congress with surprising ease. Pro-independence delegates, Adams, Franklin, the Lee brothers of Virginia, fume openly, but arithmetic is arithmetic. They lack the votes. More troubling, they lack the argument. With the resolution defeated, the political center of gravity has shifted. Dickinson's position that the colonies can secure their liberties within the British Empire no longer sounds like timidity. It sounds like pragmatism. Thomas Paine, whose Common Sense had sold over 150,000 copies and electrified public opinion toward independence, publishes a furious broadside accusing Congress of cowardice. Dickinson's allies respond by questioning Paine's motives and foreign birth. The pamphlet war that follows splits the revolutionary coalition along lines that will never fully heal. But the consequences of this fracture would prove far more devastating than anyone imagined. First, though, the war itself would deliver its verdict. On August 27, 1776, the British Army under General Howe smashes Washington's forces at the Battle of Long Island. The defeat is catastrophic, over 1,000 American casualties, more than 1,000 captured, an entire army nearly trapped on Brooklyn Heights before Washington engineers a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River. In the real history, this disaster was survivable because the army was fighting for something declared and sacred. The Declaration of Independence, signed just weeks earlier, had given the war a name and a purpose. Soldiers knew what they bled for. Here, there is no declaration. There is a petition crawling across the Atlantic toward a king who has already declared the colonies in rebellion. Washington's men have fought and died for a cause that their own Congress has refused to name. Enlistments, already precarious, collapse. Militia units melt into the countryside. Officers who had staked their reputations on independence, men who could hang for treason, begin quietly calculating their options. Washington writes to Congress in language barely concealing his fury. He needs men, money, and a reason to fight that he can articulate to farmers standing in the rain with muskets. Congress sends him a copy of Dickinson's petition. Lord Howe is not merely a general. He is also a peace commissioner, empowered by the Crown to negotiate, and he is shrewd enough to recognize what the failed vote has given him. A united colonial front was dangerous. A fractured one is an opportunity. In September, Howe dispatches letters to individual colonial assemblies, not to Congress, but directly to the colonies themselves, bypassing the body that has proven it cannot speak with one voice. The terms are generous by the standards of imperial governance. Full pardons for all who lay down arms. Restoration of local legislative authority. A promise to revisit the taxation grievances that had sparked the crisis. New Jersey's delegation wavers first. Their colony sits directly in the path of the British advance, their farms already burning. Maryland follows, its merchant class calculating that trade with Britain matters more than solidarity with Massachusetts. The offers are poison wrapped in silk, but they are also rational, and rationality is what Dickinson's Congress has promised to embody. Adams watches these deliberations with the sickened clarity of a man who can see the ending before it arrives. Benjamin Franklin sails for Paris in the autumn of 1776, carrying the hopes of the independence faction in his luggage. He is 70 years old, famous throughout Europe, and utterly without leverage. The Comte de Vergennes, Louis XVI's foreign minister, receives him with exquisite courtesy and offers nothing. France has been covertly funneling arms to the colonies through Beaumarchais' fictitious trading company, Hortalis et Cie, 100,000 muskets, cannons, gunpowder, but covert aid and formal alliance are vastly different things. Vergennes wants to bleed Britain, not marry a rebellion, and there is the central problem Franklin cannot solve. France will not recognize a nation that has not declared itself to be one. There is no sovereignty to recognize, no government to treat with, no flag to salute. Franklin is asking Vergennes to risk war with Britain on behalf of colonies that have officially petitioned to remain British subjects. The absurdity of the position is inescapable. The secret arms shipments continue. But the loans that would sustain the Continental Army, the fleet that would tip the balance at sea, the formal treaty that would transform a colonial revolt into a world war, none of these materialize. Franklin writes home, "The door is not closed, but it will not open without a declaration." No one in Congress is listening. By December 1776, the Continental Army has fewer than 3,000 men. In the real history, Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton, a victory that saved the Revolution. Here, Washington still crosses the Delaware. He still wins at Trenton. But a tactical victory without strategic purpose is a candle in a hurricane. The victory buys weeks, not months. Without French loans, Congress cannot pay its soldiers. Without a declaration of independence, it cannot issue sovereign debt or negotiate as a nation. The continental dollar, already shaky, collapses entirely. Several colonial legislatures begin recalling their congressional delegates, instructing them to pursue separate negotiations with British authorities. The unified rebellion is dying by inches. Not on battlefields. Washington has proven he can fight and survive, but in committee rooms, in legislatures, in the grinding machinery of colonial politics. The revolution is being bureaucratized to death, and every week another thread pulls loose from the fabric. Dickinson himself watches this unraveling with growing horror. He had wanted reconciliation, not capitulation. He had wanted rights restored, not resistance dissolved. But the forces he helped unleash are beyond his control now. They do not come all at once. That would be too dramatic, too clean for what is actually happening. Instead, they come like a slow tide, one colony, then another, then three more, each finding its own justification, its own face-saving formula. Georgia accepts pardon terms in February 1777. South Carolina follows in March, Rutledge negotiating personally with British commanders to preserve the plantation economy. New Jersey, already occupied, formalizes what is already fact. Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, Pennsylvania itself, Dickinson's own colony, accepts a modified version of Howe's terms that restores its assembly and exempts it from direct parliamentary taxation. By the summer of 1777, the fighting continues in New England and parts of Virginia, but it is no longer a continental war. It is a series of local insurgencies, fierce in places, but without coordination, without supply lines, without a Congress to give them purpose or a treasury to give them powder. The British do not need to win every skirmish. They simply need to wait, and waiting is something empires do very well. In the spring of 1778, George Washington disbands the remnants of the Continental Army at his headquarters in the Hudson Valley. There is no formal surrender that would require a sovereign power to surrender to. There is simply a general order thanking the men for their service and releasing them to their homes. Many weep. Washington rides south to Mount Vernon and does not look back. Scattered resistance continues in Massachusetts and Connecticut for another 2 years. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys wage a guerrilla campaign in Vermont that becomes the stuff of legend and achieves nothing strategic. By 1780, Britain negotiates a final settlement that restores colonial self-governance under firm imperial oversight. Elected assemblies, appointed governors, no taxation without consultation, but ultimate authority resting in Parliament. It is, by the standards of 18th century empire, a generous peace. The colonies retain more autonomy than Ireland, more than Scotland had before the Act of Union. Dickinson and his allies declare it a victory for reason. Adams retires to Braintree and writes bitter letters that will not be published for decades. And the world turns differently. There is no constitutional republic stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. No Bill of Rights. No precedent for colonial peoples claiming sovereignty through the simple act of declaring it. France's monarchy survives another generation without the inspiration and the debt of an American alliance. The great experiment in self-governance that would have reshaped the modern world remains unrun, a hypothesis never tested, an argument never proven. All because on a sweltering July afternoon in Philadelphia, the vote came up one short.